So you've been bitten by the vintage bike bug and you really want a vintage bike and you're thinking about restoring one, but you don't know where to start and you don't want to make any stupid mistakes. And you have some questions. Well, stick around. We're going to talk about good bikes to choose, whether you should do a full restoration or maybe a resto-mod, or when to kind of deviate from that. We'll discuss that coming right up. So one of the main questions is, do you fully restore a bike or do you go with the resto-mod and sort of update the components as you go? For me, the answer is really simple after I've done a number of these, and the answer is full restoration. And don't take my word for it. Let me explain why. This right here is my first restoration. This is actually a resto-mod. This is a 1978 Raleigh 3-speed. It's called a Sports. They made these forever. As much as I love this bike and I consider this my bike, I really don't recommend it to start. For one, these old Raleighs had non-standardized threading. You can't do a whole lot with this because of the bottom bracket threading. They're 26 TPI instead of the standard 24. There's all kinds of craziness. I won't get into this bike specific. Maybe I'll do a video about that. But let me just explain that, I was excited to get this on eBay. I got a good price, and then the guy that sold it had already done all these resto modifications. This was not original. This was some plastic thing he had on there. He had some crazy modern brakes. He had some Tektros on there, I think 559s or something. But to make them fit, because they aren't C-clamps, they're asymmetrical, he had to crush the heck out of the front fender. I mean, it was mangled and beaten up, terribly to make it fit. So once I decided I wanted it to actually be nice, it looked good in pictures, but once I saw it and wanted it to be nice, I had to spend money on these new fenders, which aren't cheap if you want them in good shape. This thing here was almost as much as a whole bike because these don't come in good shape cheap, and a bunch of little things along the way. And I even had to take off the expensive crank set because I wanted to go to a more traditional crank. Well, because I didn't have the original spindle and all the other original parts, I sort of had to fake it and get an old school style metal crank thing. And I had to do that because I spent all this money on this fender and it didn't fit because the new style retro cranks scraped the fender, and it's a big mess. And I guess my point is, once you change one thing, you have to change everything. You change the cranks, then you're changing the chain, you got to worry about the chain line. Then now I know why the guy didn't have the fender on there. Then his fender didn't change. He had to have some special fender mounts. He had to bend the fender mounts. Everything was crazy. Same thing with the front. He changed the brakes, so then he had to hammer out these fenders, and so it ended up costing me more money than it should to bring it back to close to original, but not original. This isn't the original stem, so therefore these aren't the original handlebars. These may or may not be the original brake cable. Everything I had to go and rebuy. Now, because they made this bike forever, and it was during, for 20 years, I don't even know, and they made subtle changes, and it was during the bike boom, and they didn't keep great tabs on the serial numbers and all the parts that go with it. I've just made it period correct. And that's fine for most people, but the point is, it took longer, cost more, and had a high learning curve. Don't buy a modified bike. There'll always be some like seat posts, you don't necessarily need it. You definitely don't want original tires, original chains. I'll go into all what you want to kind of change when you get it, but try to get as original as possible, because anything major that's changed, either they didn't or they had to change everything down the line. So I don't recommend that. So let's get into the fun one, which is a real true restoration. Full restoration, and why I recommend full restorations. For one, if you do a resto-mod, and especially if you do a Frankenbike, which are fun, there is no end in sight. You can keep changing and switching and upgrading and doing something different and adding and subtracting, and you will end up with a bike you spent $2,500 on that's worth a tenth of that. And it's fun to do, and if that's what you want to do, that's fine, but it's not the most efficient use of your time or money. You could have restored a bunch of bikes for that. This is a full restoration, and therefore it has a stopping point. You know what seats you need to get. You know what cranks there are. You know what brakes there are. I even went and found some new old stock tape and wrapped it the old school way. OEM hoods. Everything is like it would be when it was new. Of course, it's not new. You know, the paint's faded. There's a little bit of scratches. And I'll get into that. My idea on that is if it's not bad, you know, you can always repaint it. So why repaint it now? Although I have seen some repainted bikes that's making me rethink that. But basically, as long as there's no rust or major problems, it can always be repainted. So I don't know if it's a pro or con to do that as far as the collectability of it. I think it's 50-50. Some people appreciate it, some people want it original. But as you can see here, this is original down to the cothered cranks. And a lot of these old bikes have cothered cranks. And I wouldn't be scared of cothered cranks, but you probably don't want to start with a cothered crank bike. For one, the tool just to even work on these cothered cranks, I'm talking about just take them on and off. You're going to be out like $100 just to even deal with cothered cranks. And that's probably not the best use of your money. We can just go a little further down the timeline and get a bike with, you know, press-on ISO, sort of tapered spindle cranks. So one thing I wouldn't necessarily recommend jumping into cothered cranks, but if you love those bikes, there's a million cothered crank bikes out there. Cothered cranks are real cheap. A lot of people are scared of them. I think they're beautiful. They've got this, they're heavy, they're metal, but they've got this nice thin aesthetic that matches the thin tubing aesthetic of a, you know, a lugged bike. So if you love the cothered cranks, don't be afraid of them. Just realize you're going to have to spend about $100 in tools to sort of play with them. And I'll put a link in the description of what tools I'm talking about, and then that way, you know, once you have those tools, they'll outlast you and the bike. And then once you get one, you can buy cothered crank bikes to your heart's content and probably get some really good deals. A couple of things to know when you're actually going for a full sort of restoration, sort of a complete perfect restoration, whatever perfect means. You kind of have to do all the same work to a $50 bike or a $50,000 bike. Hopefully if you buy a $50,000 bike, it's all perfect, but if you're going to restore a bike, if you buy an expensive one or a cheap one, you still have to take it all apart. You have to clean it. You have to go through and scrub and polish all the parts and pieces, check all the bearings, repack the bearings. But the point is, whatever work you have to do on a bike, you have to do it on all the bikes. So you can take that part out of the equation. So you don't necessarily want to go too cheap of a bike. And I'm not talking about price so much as worth. You know, price, sometimes you can find great bikes for really cheap. And sometimes people want a small fortune for bikes. So now you know my thoughts on restorations versus resto mods. Let's talk about actually choosing a bike and my thoughts on choosing a bike. A couple things to think about. You want a bike that you can ride, I would assume, or the person you're restoring this for can ride. So it has to fit them. Plus, it has to be affordable and you have to be able to get parts. So sort of think about that. There are millions of bikes out there and they've been around for 100 years or more. And so there are bikes and bike parts out there. You don't want your bike too rare or you're never going to find a part, and the part is going to cost you $1 million. So keep that in mind. Get a bike that you can find parts for. One of the things you want to avoid when you're starting out is really old bikes. Bikes from the 50s, bikes from the 60s. Of course, any bike covered in rust. You don't want any of those rust buckets. It's the time you're going to spend in it probably isn't worth it. Probably avoid 70s bikes with a caveat. Usually older mid 70s bikes or even higher end early 70s bikes are going to have sort of the newer tech of the 70s, which is sort of becoming the standards to semi-modern bikes. I'm not talking about, you know, cableless RF connected shifters and all that stuff. But as far as more modern parts and standards, you can still relatively easy find. You can find them on 70s bikes, usually on the upper scale 70s bike. I will say probably avoid Raleigh bikes, definitely from the 70s, and French bikes, maybe even French bikes from the 80s. And the only reason I say that again is they didn't meet standards. You know, kind of do a little bit of research, but still find a bike you want. I mean, I don't want to discourage you if the bike you really love is on there. You can start with the bike you love, but maybe you want to start with another bike before the bike you really love so you can get the bike you love just how you love it. I'm a little scared of French bikes still myself. For one, the paint is usually pretty bad. It's true, the old adage is true, the paint jobs on those are pretty rough. And the standards and the sizes are crazy. Now, if you live in France, maybe those are easy to find. But in America, a lot of French bikes, people wanted French bikes, don't get me wrong, and people bought French bikes, but there aren't a lot of parts to pick from. I looked at a buddy of mine, he had a French bike for me, and I said, look, buddy, I'll restore this for you, but just know, for a lot of these parts, you don't have a choice other than yes or no, because they're just so rare, so strange sizes. And in the end, it was a cool French bike. He's gonna have to love it. But the time and money it would spend isn't gonna sort of show up in the bike when it's done. Unless you love it, then it's worth it. I wanna talk a little bit about high-end bikes. Now, high-end bikes are great. Like I said, high-end bikes usually are bought by people that are real cyclists. They take care of them, they sell them or pass them on to other cyclists who are going to appreciate them. And it's easier to find a high-end bike in good shape than it is a low-end bike. Just like a Ferrari from the 60s is probably in better shape than just an average Chevy from the 60s, because people who buy Ferraris take care of them. So there is that. Usually they have Campagnolo on them, and it's all friction shifting, so I don't know if necessarily the performance isn't going to be a huge gain. Sometimes the desirability and the collectability is there, so you're going to pay for that, but you can get that back and your bike is quote unquote worth more, so that's something to think about. But I would say for the beginning bike, stick in sort of the mid tier, mid to upper tier. You don't have to go with the super upper tier, and you definitely don't want to go with the lower tier because it's not worth your time and money. Another thing about upper tier bikes is they usually tend to be racing bikes. In the 80s and the 70s, a lot of the brands would also make an upper tier touring bike. Now, they weren't as many of those because, you know, racing, even to this day, racing still pushes the bike industry. So a lot of the upper end bikes are going to be racing bikes. So if you're young, buy it. If you're old like me or even younger than me, I do not want racing geometry. So if you are going to go for an upper end bike, try to find the upper end touring bikes, and that way they'll have the high end tube sets, they can have the high end group sets, they can have all the high end accessories, and you can really get your money out of them. And the people that are older usually tend to like these vintage things better, and they will really appreciate the touring bike. Everybody loves the cool old racing bikes that look very of their era. The only problem is, you know, it's going to be like riding a wedgie the whole time, and it's better to look at than ride. Let's talk about bikes to buy and where to buy them. Now, we can't talk about this without talking about eBay. eBay is great if you know exactly what you want and you're willing to pay for it. I'm not saying you can't find a good deal on eBay. You can find some great deals on eBay. You can also find people that will kind of rip you off on eBay. But I'm not even going to get into all that. What I'm going to get into is old used bikes should be relatively affordable. Unless they're already super collectible, an old used bike should be affordable. The problem that comes with eBay is the shipping. You'll find a great deal on a bike. Most of the time they're local pickup only, and hopefully you can find one near you that's worth going and getting. The problem is you're going to find this great bike, this amazing bike, and it's only $80 or $150 or whatever it is. Or maybe it's $500, that's great. But then it's going to have a shipping charge of $150 to $250. Now, if you think about taking your day off and driving 3 or 4 hours somewhere, picking up a bike and talking to the owner and giving them the money, packing it up and driving another half day back, that $150 or more for shipping is actually worth it. So the best thing to do, especially starting out, is check places like Facebook Marketplace, garage sales. Look in your local, like we have a local online classifieds around here. Check that. I don't know, maybe Craigslist is still a thing. If you can find a local bike, people are just cleaning out their garages and their basements, and they have nice bikes. Not all the time, but most of the time, they just want to go to a good home to someone who'll appreciate it. And you'll save a ton of money, and even if it's the same price, you'll save on shipping. But just like buying a car, the sort of more flexible you are about your purchase, the better off you are in finding a good deal. If you are stuck on a red 1979, I don't know, Colnago or something, you name it, doesn't matter what it is, even if it's a cheap bike, a 1979 Schwinn Varsity, well, you're going to be stuck on that, and then you got to wait for one to come up on that's your size at a price that you're willing to pay, or you're going to have to overpay for it. So you've got all these things that you have to think about. What I'm going to turn it into, what I'm willing to pay, it's got to fit me, it's got to be rideable and serviceable. So that's why my big thing to start with is actually an 80s era Japanese bike. And let me tell you why Japanese bikes are the way to go. Japan is sort of the Asian equivalent of the European Germany. They have amazing tooling, amazing engineering, and almost all the world's best of anything comes from Japan. They just have a history of being the world's best inks, paintbrushes, meats. I mean, it takes 20 years to train just to how to pat the rice to make sushi. It's insane to your advantage to get something from the handmade era from Japan. Another great thing, they were a little ahead of their time in the fact that all these are the Japanese industrial standard, sort of the standard that we use today. They were the one that made it, and it's so good we've sort of adopted it. So by the time you get to the 80s, especially with mid-tier bikes and above, you're going to have bikes that are amazing quality, and they are easy to find parts for. And look at this thing, it looks great. I mean, this thing is in great shape. Not only is it built great, it's easy to work on. It's lightweight, the tubing's great. A lot of them have Tongay tubing, great high quality tubing, in some ways lighter and butted better than famous Columbus tubing. The things they made on Italian bikes, a lot of times they have Diacomp or Diacomp, or however you want to say it. I kind of say Diacomp, I'm old school. You know, they have those brakes, which a lot of the European bikes went to in the 70s and 80s. Great quality stuff. The best thing about these old Japanese bikes is, at the time, everybody wanted an Italian bike or a French bike or even a European or even an English Raleigh bike over American bikes. And Japanese bikes just didn't have the cachet, and probably they had some stigma to them, but they didn't have the cachet as European bikes. So you can pick up, even to this day, because of that, they weren't highly sought after in their day. Collectors don't really seek them out. So fortunately for the buyer and unfortunately for the seller, they just don't hold their value. But they are amazing bikes. You can pick them up cheap, you can work on them easy, they take modern standards, and the components and the frames and everything are awesome. The paint is awesome. So that's why I recommend to start 80s Japanese bikes. You won't be sorry. I'm realizing we didn't talk Italian bikes, and there's one main reason we didn't talk Italian bikes. For one, they are some of the most sought after and collectible bikes. You shouldn't start with an Italian bike. That's just my opinion. Also, unless you really do a lot of research or you really know a lot about your Italian bikes, it's really easy to overpay for an Italian bike because it's an Italian bike and it's from an era and you think it's a great bike, and then you spend $1,700 on it and you find out that, oh, that looks like the one that people pay $2,500 for, but that's the one that people are paying $500 for. And I'm not saying that can't happen with any bike, but it's a little bit easier, at least for me, to get caught up in the sexiness and the nostalgia and sort of the cachet and all that surrounding an Italian bike. So a lot of this takes a lot of research, or enough that you feel comfortable with. but by sticking to something you can afford, you can't really get ripped off too bad. That's why I guess we didn't talk about Italian bikes and why I don't think a beginner should get an Italian bike. Not to mention, like French bikes, like the English bikes of the 70s, there are going to be some different standards or parts that you don't get. Not as bad, but in some ways they're going to be more expensive and harder to source. And I'm just trying to save you from that hole in your, burning through your pocketbook and that sort of headache.